within your field of forensic psychology. However, is there a subcategory that is located within the DSM-5 that experts would recognize as a DSM diagnosis?
Yes, sir.
And what is that, sir?
So that category would be in the trauma section of the DSM-5 TR. There's a whole category on trauma disorders, and it's most closely related to something that we call post-traumatic stress disorder. That isn't the only trauma disorder, but that's the one that what used to be called battered women syndrome. Now I refer to it as battered person syndrome, but all of it really is more connected to a trauma disorder like post-traumatic stress disorder.
Can you describe the classic system or systemology wherein an individual might necessarily suffer and then exhibit symptoms of battered women syndrome?
Yes. So battered spouse syndrome is a woman, usually a woman's response. Doesn't have to be, but that's a classic historical research went into how women respond in situations in which there's intimate partner violence, when they've been the victim of violence. Now we know, of course, in other kinds of relationships, men can be a victim of it as well, or whether it's a heterosexual or homosexual relationship, that both men and women can be victims. But we still know the majority of those individuals that are diagnosed with that condition or given that condition, classified with that condition, are women.
Bless you.
We do know that it's a reaction, a strategy that's developed by the person who's being abused to someone who's abusing them in an intimate partner situation. And essentially what they're doing is they've made a determination that they can't effectively escape from the abuse. They can't just leave for some reason. They feel in danger, or they've been threatened if they leave that something bad will happen to them. So it's a cognitive or thinking strategy on the part of the person being abused that I have to develop some coping skills or ways of protecting myself, and protecting myself or maybe even loved ones as well from some form of imminent violence or danger or lethality. Something bad will happen to me if I don't develop a way of handling this abuse, this constant abuse that's coming towards me. So the battered wife syndrome is really a way of thinking. It's a psychological change that happens with a victim in terms of the way they cope and strategize to stay safe for themselves and other loved ones as well, oftentimes.
Now, is there a specific set of criteria that a psychologist, forensic psychologist, would necessarily rely upon in attempting to make a diagnosis or an assessment of battered women syndrome?
Yes, sir.
And what are those criteria?
Well, you'd want to see, one, if some type of abuse has occurred. That abuse can be physical, it can be sexual, it can be emotional, or it can just be the threat of abuse or bad things that's going to happen to you. So there has to be something bad that's happened or that's threatened to be happening over a period of time. So abuse has to be present in order for this to be underway. Without abuse, there's no battered wife syndrome. But that's not enough. There also has to be what's called coercive control. Coercive control is really keeping the person's social interactions, overseen on a regular basis, controlling money, controlling preferences, even TV preferences, sometimes social media, looking at social media that the person is accessing or looking at, who they're talking to on Facebook, who they're texting. So it's a combination of abuse and coercive control that results in a person feeling victimized, but that's still not enough. That person then has to feel like they can't escape from that. They've either been told, if you leave me, you're going to die, or a family member is going to be harmed, your children, your mother, whatever it might be. And as a result of that, they develop strategies to cope with that, acquiescing, pleasing, doing anything they're asked to do, demeaning themselves, allowing themselves to be controlled. All of the things that would fend off, if you will, some abuse or attack or threat to them or someone who surrounds them. So those would be the components that you would need to have, and that dance continues to go on usually repeatedly throughout the course of that relationship.
So I think what you're describing is, in a sense, a subjective nature to the syndrome that's being described.
It's both objective and subjective. So objective in terms of the facts, like what's really happening. A person's being abused, they're being told certain things, there's control over them. But then a subjective part is the person's interpretation of that, their perception of that. So there's really both going on, and they have to kind of work together in order for this syndrome to be formalized and properly diagnosed.
You indicated that there's sometimes maybe some defense mechanisms that are, or strategies that are devised by the battered individual, the abused individual.
Yes, sir.
In your experience and your training, do controlled substances, alcohol, drugs frequently appear in your analysis or assessment?
Yes, and the way they appear is they can appear either from the abuser or the abused or both. What can happen from the abuser standpoint is they may only be abusive, or the abuse may become worse if they abuse substances. From the abused standpoint, it may be self-medication. It may be a way of coping with the anxiety that there's going to be something bad that potentially could happen to them or somebody else. It's kind of a way of dealing with walking on the eggshells. So if I use substances, that can deaden the pain, if you will, for me, or help me to forget about it. So it's oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes part of either the abuser's behavior or the abused behavior.
You're gonna help me take this shit out. Real shit. You're gonna help me take it out. You're gonna help me take this shit out. As I want to.
In the time that you knew Ms. Boone, did you witness anything about her person or her body that gave you cause for concern?
Sometimes I would see it like she had been choked around her neck or her arm be hurt. I have a mark on her arm. And I just asked her.
When you would ask her that, how did she appear to you to respond emotionally to your questions about her injuries?
She just say, one of them days or something.
Just for the record, instead of telling us what she would say, would she demonstrate any emotion on her face?
Well, I would see the emotion that she was upset about something.
And did you ask about her obvious upset persona? Her upset, the fact that she was upset? Would you ask her about that?
Yeah. Well,
Okay, you have to just limit your answer to the question. Would you ask her about that issue? About why she was upset?
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm sorry, I just can't go beyond that. Thank you. Now, how frequently would that occur?
I would say on the weekends when I see her.
Was that primarily when you saw her on the weekends?
Mostly I would see her walking through, going to her place. And and I'm sitting on the porch and I see her then.
Now, strike that. While you were there in that apartment complex, and excuse me for getting ahead of myself, do you still live in that apartment complex?
No.
How long have you been gone from that apartment complex? If you don't know, that's fine.
Oh, it's been a while.
Thank you, ma'am. During the occasions that you had to interact with Ms. Boone, how did she treat you?
She was a nice lady,
Overruled.
nice to me.
Did she ever act uppity?
Objection, relevance.
Overruled.
Did she ever treat you in an uppity manner?
What you mean, sir?
Did she ever look down on you as a person?
Oh, no,
Did she ever treat you with disrespect?
no.
I'm going to check this.
I'm sorry, I'm back, Mrs. Walker. In the time that you and Ms. Boone lived together, on occasion, did you see law enforcement arrive at the apartment complex?
A couple of times.
And did you ever get involved in any of their investigation?
No, sir.
Were you ever approached by law enforcement and asked for information, evidence, insight into what might be going on?
No, sir.
Now, in all candor, were there occasions when you believed that Sarah Boone may have been under the influence of alcohol?
No, I can't say.
Did you also observe George Torres during the time that you lived there in the apartment complex?
I didn't see him very much. If we sitting on the porch, that's the only time I see him.
Did you know Mr. Torres very well?
No,
Was there an incident when you saw Ms. Boone with a black eye?
yes,
Did you witness a pattern between Ms. Boone and Mr. Torres wherein you observed signs of abuse?
Sustained.
You testified that you saw Ms. Boone on occasion with bruises, other injuries, and a black eye. Is that correct? Is that accurate?
yes.
And was there any pattern to what you observed in regards to those injuries and bruises that you observed on Ms. Boone?
One time I seen with a black eye and like she had been choked one time.
Okay. Did Ms. Boone complain to you about those marks?
Yes,
Thank you, Your Honor. Nothing further.
Any cross-examination?
Hi, Ms. Walker.
oh,
Is it fair to say you're not sure when exactly you saw any of those injuries on her, correct?
say that again?
You're not exactly sure when you saw any of those injuries on her, correct?
When she come past the apartment, I'll be sitting out there, because we always sit out there.
Right, but we don't know if this is December or 2018 or anything
I
like that.
can't remember, sir.
Okay. And is it fair to say you have no idea how she got those marks? Is that fair?
Repeat that again?
Do you have any idea how she got those marks?
On the weekends, I see him and her go in.
Okay. But you don't know who, if anybody, put those marks on her, right?
Well,
Just calls for yes or no.
I can tell when they must have had an argument or something. I hear the dogs barking.
Okay. And you're 5 doors down, right? Unit 8, Unit 3?
Yeah.
No other questions?
Yes. So as a forensic psychologist, sometimes I am tasked with testifying about something very specific. So for instance, a person's ability to stand trial if they're knowledgeable and can go forward with their trial process. I've testified about a person's sanity at the time of the offense, meaning if they had a mental health condition that met the statute as to not being sane at the time of the offense. I've testified in sentencing hearings. I've been an expert witness for Department of Children and Families. I've testified in vocational rehabilitation hearings as their expert, in what's called social investigation. That's what they used to call custody evaluations. So in numerous capacities.
When did you first get involved with Miss Boone?
It would have been in around June of 2020. It was the first I heard of her case.
And what were you asked to do?
A comprehensive psychological evaluation of Ms. Boone.
And did you do that in Miss Boone's case?
I did.
Okay. Can you tell the jury what you did as part of your evaluation of Sarah Boone?
Well, we had clinical forensic interview in which I reviewed her background history, so her early childhood. I also assessed her with assessments, meaning I administered 3 psychological tests to her. I reviewed her prior mental health records, her interrogation video, some prior information about her legal history. So she had been previously arrested. I reviewed that as well. We had an opportunity to review the transcript of her interrogation video. So there were a variety of things that would be considered what I did with her.
Okay. Now, do you believe that Sarah Boone does have some narcissistic traits?
I do.
She doesn't qualify or meet the criteria for that diagnosis, does she?
I did not diagnose her with that.
Have you diagnosed her with anything?
Yes, so she has a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. She has symptoms of anxiety that would be consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. So that is an anxiety disorder.
And you feel like she suffers from post-traumatic stress?
I do.
And did you determine that she did suffer from trauma as a result of intimate partner violence?
That was my conclusion. Yes, that's my opinion.
Okay, and given the assessment that you did with Sarah Boone, and considering the totality and the time you spent with her and the other records, did you diagnose Sarah Boone with anything?
Yes, so post-traumatic stress disorder, it's my opinion at the time of the offense, she had depression and she had an alcohol use disorder.
And is it your understanding that this trauma that one suffers from repeat domestic violence can cause one to be considered suffering from the syndrome, we call it battered spouse or battered woman syndrome?
Yes, so the diagnosable condition would be PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. That's how a clinician would label the response to trauma. The pattern between partners, the person's coping mechanism because of that trauma, that would be what's considered battered spouse or battered partner syndrome.
And you're aware that that concept of being traumatized by the battered spouse syndrome or the post-traumatic stress is relevant to a self-defense case in a
Yes,
criminal context.
yes, I understand that.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, under the battered spouse syndrome, the person would experience a trauma or a situation in which they feared harm. And based on that fear of harm, they would react in a certain way that might not be understandable to other people. So their fear is based on the pattern of behavior between them and their partner. That might not be the case for another set of people.
Fair to say that psychologically, the abuser, does alcohol often involved in the abuse?
Yes.
And as far as the victim that's getting abused, you say it's a cycle, is the victim, when they go through that last stage, the honeymoon stage, are they thinking, okay, it's going to be better?
Yes, the hopefulness in that, trying to believe that the behavior has changed, that they're not going to be abused again, the hopefulness to maintain the relationship, to forgive. That's part of that last stage, phase 3, is maintaining the relationship.
I don't think I've asked this. Why would someone who has been exposed to intimate partner violence perceive the likelihood of a new violent event about to appear? Why would they perceive the likelihood of that violence differently than, say, a normal person?
Well, it speaks to the pattern. So any relationship will have its own special pattern, that you have things that only your partner knows about you, or certain looks that you give that mean something, and you learn that over time. So over a period of incidents, basically, the victim begins to perceive cues that would signal impending danger. Those cues could be really subtle, just a change in tone, or some small behavior that might not mean much to another person, but it has preceded other violent acts. So for instance, if your husband decides that he is not going out that night, he might put on different clothes to stay home. And that could be a signal, like abuse and violence has occurred in his stay-at-home clothes, for instance. That might not mean much to another person because, again, it's specific to that dyad. Those two people know those patterns. So the victim may perceive a small or subtle change in their partner as a cue because they've become hypervigilant. The body knows when it's experienced a threat to itself, and it will take note. We record memories differently when we're at risk. So these subtle cues become very well memorized by somebody who's being victimized.
Now, on this, and battered spouse syndrome is a subset of post-traumatic stress disorder, which you've diagnosed Sarah Boone with. When those personality changes occur and they persist after an individual has been exposed to this extreme stress, is that when the diagnosis occurs?
The changes would be as a result of the pattern. The person experiences a change, like in their sleeping, in their hypervigilance. That's when you can diagnose it. So you can have a trauma or an experience of a scary incident, but it doesn't mean that you will absolutely have post-traumatic stress disorder. You have to have those reactive symptoms that would suggest that it's present.
In your opinion, and I know you've gone over this event with Sarah Boone, this February 23rd, 2020 event, is your opinion that she was suffering from battered spouse syndrome at the time of that event?
Yes, she had the patterns ingrained in her behavior that would be typical of a victim who's responding to traumatic events in a predictable way. So that would fit that.
And it's fair to say that because of the intimate partner and the prior violence, that you would have a heightened sense of when danger was about to occur.
Yes,
When a threat was about to occur.
yes,
A threat of danger.
that's right.
What are the agreed upon criteria for battered spouse syndrome?
Well, you would evaluate if the person is indeed suffering from a behavioral response, like a mental disorder. So first of all, has the person demonstrated that they've got a behavioral change? And is it in response to a violent act? Do they perceive threat where they've been exposed in the past? So pattern of violence that has repeated.
But trauma is in the eye of the beholder. Is that fair? Whether a negative experience traumatizes somebody is going to be in the eye of the person who experienced that stimuli, correct?
I only partially agree with you. It's a complicated answer because some of the manifestations of trauma are behavioral. So for instance, when I evaluate veterans who have returned and they may not know that they've been traumatized, their bodily responses that include like difficulty concentrating, they can't sleep, they're hypervigilant. The PTSD diagnosis encompasses outward manifestations. So even though they don't acknowledge trauma, you can still identify it as a clinician.
And so when diagnoses predate a violent intimate partner relationship, there is an independent cause, even though they may then later contribute to the phenomenon we see, correct?
Well, I wouldn't say that all mental disorders have an independent cause.
Okay.
Sometimes they're spontaneous or biological in nature.
And then there came a point in time where Mr. Torres was getting mad about being zipped in the suitcase.
She told me that he was getting mad.
And that, in turn, made her mad.
That's right.
What Mr. Torres was saying was, I can't breathe, correct?
That is what's recorded on the video.
Well, I'm asking you about what you reported her saying.
Well, what made her mad was not that he was saying he couldn't breathe. It's what he was saying that was making her mad.
Well, what else was he saying?
At the time, she said that he said something that was making her mad. And so that's the extent of what we talked about at that moment.
So you didn't elaborate what something was that made her mad, correct?
Right. She said he said something that made her mad, and that started making her mad.
The state attorney talked to you about power and control, that an abusive partner will use power and control over the victim in a intimate partner violence situation.
Yes.
Threatening someone's dogs, is that an example of someone using control?
Yes.
Taking car keys from the other party, is that an example of control?
If they're withholding, yes.
Taking a phone and withholding a phone,
Yes.
a debit card,
Yes.
destroying a home, TVs, putting holes in the wall,
Yes.
not helping pay the rent and other bills.
So I would say that that could be withholding, that could go under coercive control of another person.
What about violating a court order to have no contact with the person?
Yes.